Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on church and ministry compliance. I am Roy Harriman with Ministry Pacific, and I'm joined by Max Herr, a specialist in regulatory compliance for churches and nonprofit organizations. Max, thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you.
We would love to hear that you're with us and where you're joining us from. So far, we're Utah, West Virginia, California, Garden Grove, Arkansas, Utah. Wow, what a diverse audience nationwide. So Sacramento, so excited to hear from all of you today. Without further delay, let me introduce our guest. Max Herr is president of Church and Ministry Compliance Consulting, and he has more than 25 years of experience in insurance, financial services, compliance, and governance, including more than 10 years as a church treasurer. And Max served as a church compliance specialist for the California Southern Baptist Convention for 6 years. So Max, welcome again. Well, my first question for you, Max, is this. Just out of sheer curiosity, what led you to a career of reading fine print, reading insurance policies, bylaws, rummaging through IRS regulations? Most people are running in the other direction.
Well, somebody's got to do that. And I suppose in another circumstance, I might have become a lawyer, but I've always had a fascination with the law. I have an associate degree from many years ago in administration of justice. And when I was working on my master's degree, it was an analysis of a Supreme Court case on regulation in cable television. And that's where I really got an appreciation of reading case law and appellate decisions and Supreme Court decisions. And it's just something that I don't know, I guess it kind of comes naturally to me. In my insurance work, I need to be able to read and understand insurance contracts because I testify as an expert witness in a variety of different insurance matters. And reading and understanding and being able to explain the contract is key to what I do. And many times I have to educate attorneys on exactly what it is they're seeing when they look at an insurance contract.
Well, you're right. Somebody's got to do it. And we're glad that you chose to be one of those somebodies, because those of us who are working in ministry and nonprofit world, we need people who are focused on where the guardrails are, what alerts are out there, and what warnings we need to pay attention to. So let me start out with, it seems like a softball question, but I think we got to clear the air with it. When it comes to regulations, state, federal, even local, is ignorance of the law an excuse that will grant you a get out of jail free card?
Well, I think most everybody would understand that old expression, ignorance of the law, is no excuse. And when it comes to corporate compliance, absolutely the same thing is true. What a corporation doesn't understand, what they don't know, can definitely come back to bite them. And especially in the world of church work and ministry, there are very few people who pay attention to what's going on, and they get caught by surprise many times when an allegation is lodged at the church or somebody has an issue and sues the church. It's just not a pleasant circumstance. And that's one of the focuses of my ministry, is keeping churches up to date on new changes in the law. I'm attending webinars 4, 5, 6 times a year on compliance matters and updates to legislation and things. So I try to stay up on top of it, but even some of the things that escape my attention, I have to be able to find the information and distill it quickly.
Well, Max, you talked about your work as a ministry, and it definitely is. You are supporting, it is a ministry first and foremost, but then you're also supporting churches and nonprofits so that they can continue and be successful in their mission without being distracted or have the resources diverted because of a legal matter that was unavoidable. Some things you simply can't predict and you can't avoid, but so many of these we can. Another question for you is, what would you say are the top 3 areas of misunderstandings that can sometimes embroil churches and nonprofits?
Well, absolutely. The number one compliance issue that gets churches into trouble is failing to file what's known here in California as a statement of information. And in many other states, it's simply called an annual report, where you list the principal office address, the mailing address, the names of your required corporate officers, president, secretary, treasurer, and usually an agent for service of process. In virtually every state where that's a requirement, there are only a handful of states that don't have that requirement. But where it is a requirement, failure to file can lead to either suspension of the corporation, or in some states, it results in a dissolution, what's called an administrative dissolution of the corporation. The corporation just no longer exists. And that's just it's a dreadful circumstance. When I was working with the California Southern Baptist Convention, that was one of my key priorities, was to make sure that our churches were filing their statements of information. And several years ago, the Franchise Tax Board here in California was given the authority to administratively dissolve corporations that didn't file their annual statement 2 consecutive times. So for churches and nonprofits, that's a 4-year period, 2 filings. And I discovered that almost 24 out of our 2,400 churches had been administratively dissolved, and they were all still operating, albeit unlawfully. So that's definitely number one. Number 2 on the list is going to be personnel matters, primarily either misclassification of employees as contractors or failure to pay minimum wage. Again, here in California, we have a state where the law now stands that all workers of an employer are employees unless the employer can prove that the individual meets an ABC test of independent contractor status. That law that came into effect a couple of years ago, AB 5, didn't really change anything for churches, because churches have largely been misclassifying 4 particular types of employees for many decades. And those 4 types of employees are custodians, musicians, clerical workers, and childcare workers or nursery workers. They've been treating them as independent contractors, paying them token amounts of money to come to the church and provide some services. And it's just wrong. And churches keep trying to find what they refer to as a workaround. How do we get around this? We don't want to have to pay the employer's share of FICA. Sorry, there is no workaround to this. And it's a serious issue because California and a number of other states have adopted laws called wage theft. And if you're not paying employees the legal minimum wage, somebody in the church could technically end up going to jail for a misdemeanor or even a felony conviction, depending on the amount of money that hasn't been paid. So it's a very serious issue, and I work hard to help churches understand that you can't just call something a love offering or a stipend and avoid the income tax issues that go along with being an employee. Third in the list would probably be stuff related to property taxes and property tax exemptions. And again, these are things that, if not handled correctly, can cause a church to lose thousands of dollars in the unnecessary payment of property taxes. I mean, the law in virtually every state is clear that the property of churches is supposed to be exempt from taxation. But I don't know of any state where it's just automatic. You call yourself a church and you don't pay property tax. In every state, to the best of my knowledge, it requires filing a request for exemption with the local county assessor. And a particular problem that happens is when a church changes its name. Churches operated under a name for many years or decades in some cases, but they more recently have been operating under a different community name, and they decide to change the corporation name to the name that the community knows them as. Then they go in and they change the name on the deed, and it automatically triggers the computer that handles the assessment rolls to think that this property has been sold or transferred in ownership, and it absolutely eliminates the property tax exemption. Sometimes that results in a mid-year, what's called a supplemental tax bill, but most of the time it results in a new property tax bill that comes along about September, October. The church is surprised. We've been paying $1,000 a year for the last 10 years, and now we're hit with a $20,000 property tax bill. I had one church here in Northern California that had the church name in English and Spanish on the property tax bill. And somehow the English name of the church got taken off, and it was just the Spanish name of the church. And that did exactly the same thing. It triggered the loss of their property tax exemption. And the next thing the pastor knew, they got a property tax bill for $42,000. And I worked with the church and the assessor to get that whole issue resolved, but it happened in the midst of all the COVID chaos, and offices were closed and you couldn't get a hold of anybody. And it took months to resolve that issue. In my ebook, I detail a particular circumstance of a church down in Florida that got a $7 million property tax bill because they had rented out space in their parking lot to food trucks, and they had rented out space in their building to a for-profit school. And the assessor came in and said, well, this is how much money you owe in back taxes and interest and penalties. And imagine a church that once had several thousand members that's now down to 150 members. Where are they going to come up with $7 million to pay a tax bill? It's just not a pleasant thing. So I think those really are the top three issues.
Those all are definitely a case of what you don't know can really hurt you. As you mentioned on the case that you helped resolve because of the name change issue, there's never a good time for something like that to come up. COVID was even a worse time. In your book, which you bring out again, 7 Significant Issues, it seems that, just to focus in on one of those, it seems that when churches and ministries engage in any kind of a business endeavor, such as renting space or collecting revenue of any sort, things can get tricky or risky. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of things to be alert for when it comes to churches and business?
Churches, because of the nature of their property, many churches have relatively unused portions of a parking lot or vacant land portions that haven't been designated for other use. And you'll get a company that wants to come in and put up a cellular phone tower. More recently, there are companies emerging that want to put solar powered battery storage units when there's a lot of land available. Churches are frequently approached by other organizations that are looking for space to conduct a daycare or a school, or just looking for some office space. And churches are generally free to rent their property to anybody they choose. One of the primary issues, though, from the perspective of the Internal Revenue Service, is something called unrelated business income. And the first question that the church needs to ask itself is our property debt financed? Do we have a mortgage on the property? Because the IRS takes the view that any income that a church derives from renting its property when it's mortgaged is only renting that property to come up with money to pay the mortgage rather than using its own funds. And so it automatically declares that revenue as unrelated business income. which is taxed at the 21% corporate rate. By the same token, renting your facility to a for-profit venture of any kind, like the cell tower or the battery storage or a for-profit daycare, is going to cause the church to lose some or perhaps even all of its property tax exemption. And I've had situations where churches got into a lease agreement with an organization, a school of some kind in one case, and they never bothered to check to see if the school was a nonprofit entity. And when I asked the question, they said, well, aren't all schools nonprofits? And I said, well, not until you check to see how they're registered with the state. Montessori schools, for example, those are primarily for-profit organizations, and most daycares are not organized in any way as a nonprofit. And so when we checked, sure enough, they were incorporated as a stock corporation. And that meant the church was going to lose a good portion of its property tax exemption. And the amount of money that they were collecting in rent wasn't even going to be enough to cover the property tax exemption. So we had to work with that organization to unwind the lease that they had entered into. When a church doesn't have debt, it's free to rent its property to anyone. The challenge that can cause is turning the property into what's called a place of public accommodation. And in doing that, the church will lose some of the protections that it has to the use of its property. Under normal circumstances, the church can deny the use of its facilities on a doctrinal basis. But if the church has been declared a place of public accommodation because it's renting to other outside organizations, they may be in a situation where they're forced to rent to users that they would otherwise not want on their campus. The search for revenue is a difficult challenge for many churches, especially smaller churches. It needs to be broached very carefully.
Not only is it difficult to manage a business that actually results in a profit, but then when you tag on all of the regulatory matters and exemptions, it could become exponentially difficult. Now, just so I and our listeners understand, the church example that you mentioned that leased part of its facility to a for-profit corporation, did they lose their tax exemption like through an executive decision, or simply was it not enough to cover the increased taxes that they had to pay?
Well, in that particular circumstance, we were able to undo the lease within about 6 weeks of the starting date. It didn't actually have an effect on their property tax, but had that lease not been undone, this church certainly would have been facing a loss of some of its property tax exemption. It wouldn't have lost all of it, but it would have lost a significant portion.
So in a situation like that, does a governing authority try to determine what part of the property is no longer used for nonprofit work and somehow divides it up?
Yeah,
as a matter of speaking.
In almost all jurisdictions, it's a mathematical formula based on the percentage of the total property area that is not being used, the amount of time that it's not being used as a percentage of a 168-hour week. And then that determines the percentage of property exemption that is removed. So depending on the total size of a church's property, if they're on a very small lot, renting all of the classroom space could result in a loss of 40% of the property tax exemption. And that can be significant if you're in a high cost community.
That is an excellent point. And yeah, it could seem that being the host of a daycare or something like that would be a purely innocent decision. Not that it's not innocent, but a decision without any kind of downsides. but until you do the homework, you don't know.
I saw a question pop up
Mhm.
asking if there was a threshold on income when it comes to renting to a for-profit business. Whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit business, if the rent is going to be determined to be unrelated business income, the net amount of that revenue that exceeds $1,000 is the portion that's taxable. And I want to make clear that when a church is debt financed, it doesn't matter who they rent to. They can rent to another church. They can rent to a for-profit business. It doesn't matter. The revenue from any of that stream is going to be taxed as unrelated business income.
Excellent question, Kenneth. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it just brings up the point that when we as churches and nonprofits engage in activities really outside our normal realm, we need to get input, we need to get counsel. You have mentioned that churches and ministries can have misunderstandings about employment matters. So wrongly classifying employees and or not paying mandated wages. Can you give us a bird's eye view of the potential for misunderstanding here and what often happens?
Well, the single biggest misunderstanding, and this is really nationwide, is the distinction between contractors and employees, and then within the employee classifications, the difference between non-exempt and exempt employees. The federal legislation that governs most of this is known as the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA. And in the FLSA, it defines what an exempt or non-exempt employee is. And a non-exempt employee is one who must be paid overtime wages if they work more than 40 hours a week. Here in California, the law says more than 8 hours in a day or 40 hours in a week. Other states have a similar definition in their laws. The exempt employee is one who's paid a salary based on a 40-hour week. There's no prorated salary for an exempt employee who works part-time and isn't paid the statutory minimum wage for exempt employees. They don't get paid overtime. They don't necessarily have to clock in or clock out. If they work 1 hour a week, or if they work 100 hours a week, they get paid the same amount of money. The federal law outside of California, the minimum wage that has to be paid to an exempt employee who meets the definition of an exempt employee is more than $35,000 a year. Here in California, it's almost $55,000 a year, and next year it's going to go up to more than $60,000 a year. Churches, unfortunately, think if I just pay a salary to my employees, I don't have to worry about overtime. And the law allows you to pay a flat salary, but it doesn't allow you to classify somebody exempt from overtime unless they meet one of the 3 specific definitions. And that's a problem for many churches because they are just looking for ways not to pay folks what folks are supposed to be paid. In California, this new ABC test that we've had for the last couple of years is slowly being adopted in other states. For churches, the reason that it's virtually impossible to classify any of your employees as a contractor is the B part of that test that says the work that this person is providing for the church or the employer is outside the usual course of the employer's business. And when you think about the business of the church, the usual course of business includes Sunday worship. When you call a musician an independent contractor and give him $50 to play an hour's worth of music on Sunday morning, it's a misclassification because they are performing at the direction of the church. They can't come and go as they please. They can't show up on Saturday and play music for Sunday morning. They can't choose their own music. They are providing a service within the confines of the usual business of the church. Same thing with the fellow who volunteers to be the custodian and clean up the church for Sunday morning, but the church gives them $100 a month to do that. They're not an independent contractor, they're an employee, and their wages are subject to income tax withholding. They're subject to FICA, Social Security, and Medicare. It's just very, very challenging. The folks that are truly independent contractors are the plumbers, the electricians, the painters, the carpet cleaning companies, the outside custodian services that you hire by contract, landscapers and others. The real tip-off to a difference between an employee and a contractor is that most of the time, when you write checks to a contractor, you write the check to the name of a business, not to the name of an individual.
It sounds to me like it is sage advice to have somebody just evaluate your employment classifications so that if there's a problem, you can know about it. Related, is this something that you can do for churches, Max, is evaluate their employment classifications?
I do that all the time.
Okay.
And it's a challenge in some churches because this is a practice that they've been engaged in for 10 or 15 or 20 years or longer. And by the same token, lots of churches are on the fringe of being in trouble for compensating volunteers. And a volunteer is a person who specifically provides services with no expectation of compensation. So if you say to the folks at church, we're going to have a work day here at the church next Saturday, and everybody who shows up is going to get a $25 gift card, you've just made an agreement with these folks that you're going to compensate them for their services. In many states, California and others, you can't pay an employee with a gift card like that. You have to pay the employee in cash. This can be a double violation on the part of a church to compensate a volunteer and then compensate them in a way that's prohibited by law.
Yes, and the heart is in the right place, but unfortunately it conflicts with the law. So we just have to find other creative ways to show appreciation that don't give us difficulty.
And absolutely, and that can be done. It's usually, to do it properly, it's done at the end of a year to thank the volunteers for their service this year. It doesn't mean that we're going to do that again next year, and we're not providing them compensation for next year's volunteer service. By the same token, October that just passed us by is Pastor Appreciation Month, and many churches invite their folks to put money in the offering plate for pastor appreciation. And all that money that's collected by the church and handed to the pastor has to be reported as taxable income to the pastor. On the other hand, if folks just handed a gift card to the pastor or a card of appreciation and put in a $20 bill or a check or whatever written to the pastor, and the church wasn't involved in that in any way other than saying, October is Pastor Appreciation Month, you're encouraged to show your appreciation to the pastor. That's just a gift. It's a non-deductible gift from the individual to the pastor, and he doesn't have to report it as income. So there are better ways to do some things than others that won't get the church in trouble when it comes to income and income reporting.
That's excellent to know. I'm sure you saw this question, Max. Tiani says, just to clarify, an employee that is classified exempt in California should be making $55,000 per year. Can you clarify that for us?
Yes, in California, I don't know of any other state that has a similar definition, but the definition of the minimum salary for an exempt worker is 2 times the minimum wage, hourly wage, times 40 hours, times 52 weeks. And so if you take California's statewide minimum wage, which is $14 an hour, and multiply that times 2, you get 28. You multiply that by 40, you get another larger for 1,200 and something. And if you multiply that by 52, now you get 54,200. I think it's $240 or $280. Next year, minimum wage that was originally scheduled to go to $15 an hour was announced a few months ago is actually going to be $15.50 an hour. So now that's going to add $3 times 40 times 52 to that $54,000 question.
Terry asks, where can I find more information, for example, written law about musicians not being contractors?
Well, you're not going to find written law that says musicians are not contractors. What you're going to find if you're in California is the ABC test of the AB5 legislation. And the A test is the traditional test, who controls the activities of the employee or the worker. The B test that we discussed is the work outside the usual course of the employer's business? And the C part of the test is, does this worker have an independently established business? Very few of the musicians will have an independent business. There are some drummers who are freelance musicians, but again, they're going to fail the A and B part of the test because they are under the control of the church and they are performing services that are within the usual course of the employer's business. And there's just no escape from that.
Now, I believe what you said, Max, is that at this point, that's California, but more states are adopting similar.
Yeah, I just 2 weeks ago, I was on a webinar talking about employment law nationwide, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Department of Labor is beginning to introduce this same ABC test as another way of defining who an employee is, by defining employees as persons who are not contractors under a similar definition.
I believe this was a comment, but we'll just see if you have anything to add. John says the city of Provo was also interested in our church's use of any motor vehicles and or personal property when we applied for property tax exemption.
Generally, the laws on property taxes say that the personal property and what would be known as the business personal property of a church is also exempt from property taxation. It's an increasing problem that we're seeing here in California, and it may be true in other states as well, that the assessor is now demanding churches provide a complete inventory of the stuff in the church, the whiteboards, the chairs, the tables, the desks, how many computers, file cabinets, all this stuff. And for years, they just ignored that. The assessors never made those requests. And now it seems like one county assessor started it and other county assessors are piggybacking onto it. It doesn't change the scenario. It doesn't change the fact that that property is exempt, and it's going to take a church or another nonprofit organization to sue a county assessor after they have been embroiled in some kind of administrative action for not supplying the inventory. And I don't think assessors want to go down that path. They're looking for voluntary compliance, so to speak. But I think there's an ulterior motive that they're going to find some kind of loophole in property tax law to exploit and start sending business or churches business tax assessments on their personal property. And it's going to be it'll be a big to-do here in California as the counties look for additional revenue to support the things that they're doing.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's not as if assessors just don't have anything to do, so they are decided to find more items just to categorize for no purpose. So no, that's a good point. Max, and on another question, and thank you everyone for the excellent questions and comments. Churches are not required by law to have insurance that is either property or liability. Now, exemptions would be workers' compensation is required. And then if you're have a church or nonprofit vehicle, insurance is required for that vehicle. So in general, however, churches are not required by law to have insurance, either property or liability. Yeah, a bank may require it, for a mortgage, but government doesn't. So at the risk of sounding self-serving here, let me just ask you, is foregoing insurance or diminishing insurance or getting a bare bones policy, is that a good way to save money?
It's probably the worst decision a business could make is to not be properly insured. And churches have to recognize that they are businesses. Churches have two personalities. One is the one that we all recognize, the spiritual side of the church, and the part that lots of folks don't want to recognize or just want to ignore is the civil or business side of the church. California, again, because that's where I'm located, we are the most litigious state in all the United States. You look at somebody the wrong way, if they don't stab you, they sue you. And churches are not immune from lawsuits. Somebody slips and falls on your property, they break a bone, chances are they're going to find an attorney who wants to sue the church for negligence. And the best benefit of having that liability insurance policy is the insurance company will defend you in that lawsuit. You may not win, but you won't have to pay the attorney for his services, and the insurance company is going to cover most or all of the rest of the claim. As with any kind of insurance, if you wait until you need it, you've waited a day too long. And for churches in particular, the kinds of things that churches find themselves in legal challenges are not areas that all insurance policies cover routinely. And that's one of the reasons why I recommend to churches that you do business with an agency that, like Ministry Pacific, that represents companies that specialize in insuring churches and nonprofits, because you're going to get a policy that includes all of the essential coverage that you can get from other insurance companies, but these are standard inclusions and not extra additions that you have to get from a household name insurance company. The kinds of things that churches absolutely need include coverage like directors and officers, sexual misconduct, religious liberty expression, and a variety of other things that are very particular to churches that you don't see in a typical general liability policy for other types of businesses.
Generally, I know this is true, for example, in the United Kingdom, when it comes to litigation, the loser pays the court fees. But in the United States, for the most part, that is not true. If you are sued and you need legal representation, everyone is the loser, even if you win. And litigation is extremely expensive. There seems to be more and more litigation involving churches and nonprofits. Yes, we do. At Ministry Pacific, we welcome calls and questions. Consultations are always free. A number of people watching now and who will be watching later on YouTube may think, look, I get what you're saying. I believe you. We've got to comply with all these laws, but I just don't want to have anything to do with it. So is it possible to delegate all of this out? By delegate, I mean, essentially you're paying or contracting it out, or do you still have to have your hands on it to some degree? What can you mostly move under the oversight of experts? What do you still have to own?
Well, when a church has a fair number of employees, probably in the neighborhood of 5 or 10 or more employees, you can certainly outsource many of the personnel issues. You can hire an independent HR facilitator who will manage employee policies and procedures. They will handle payroll issues. They'll do tax reporting for the church. More than just a payroll service will do. From a compliance perspective, there are really no organizations that will actually come in and take over your overall compliance responsibilities. Most compliance organizations or companies that charge fees for what they do, they're just giving you background support and helping you understand what your compliance requirements are. That's the same thing I do. I do it essentially on a free will basis. If I am asked by a church to help them revise or modernize their bylaws, I don't charge to do that. And when the process is done, if they see value in the help that I've provided and they want to send some money my way, that's fine. I accept that. But I don't come in and say, I'm going to charge you $500 to modernize your bylaws, or I'm going to charge you $50 a month to be a consultant. That's not what my ministry is focused on.
But it sounds like you will essentially, if don't let me say this incorrectly, but serve as essentially a virtual compliance officer if someone requests that.
I will help them set out their compliance requirements, help them identify what they need to do, and show them how to manage those things rather than do it for them.
Okay. So so it sounds like the breakdown is, at the end of the day, the officers still have to be officers, but you can certainly delegate and use professional services for a number of things that are generally outside the realm of church. So accounting,
Sure.
taxation, human
Yeah,
resources.
I with 10 years of experience as a church treasurer and doing all the financial reporting and things, I can teach a church how to set up its accounting system and how to provide proper financial reports. I can teach someone who can add and subtract to be the church treasurer, because the work is not that complex once you have it organized properly. Recruiting a church treasurer is sometimes one of the most difficult things a church has to do, because people think the work is too complex and have to know a lot of laws and things, and it's not so. I mean, the work of the church treasurer is a couple of hours a week in the typical church. It's not a time-consuming thing. By the same token, every corporation has to have a board of directors, and one of the things that I do is board of director training, so that directors know what their responsibilities and obligations are. One of the ways I do this is through something I call a compliance fire drill, which can be a half day or a full day workshop, depending on the needs of the church. And we go over the bulk of their compliance responsibilities and what it means to be a director and how you approach your duties and responsibilities. And a large part of that is making sure that those things are explained in the bylaws of the church.
Very helpful. Do you do the compliance fire drill? Do you do that in person only, or do you do a virtual version if that's what's needed?
Here in California, I prefer to do it personally,
Right.
just because the feedback, I think, is better for me as a teacher and instructor, to be able to see folks' faces and their reactions to what I'm saying. I can do it virtually. I'm happy to do it virtually. The experience may be a little bit different than doing it in person, but I think it's still going to be just as effective.
Sounds like a very valuable use of time. And you say it's about a half day.
Yeah, the basic fire drill is 4 to 4.5 hours, and when we do it as a full day, it's covering the same 20 or more topics. Just we have more time to discuss individual topics and dig deeper into some of the things that need a little more explanation.
So related to this, Max, in your experience, are ministry staff usually prepared in any way to deal with the regulatory side of ministry in seminary or even through informal training?
Some seminaries have included a course or two on church administration, but I don't think they delve specifically into many of the compliance issues. The comment that I hear from pastors when I do a compliance fire drill, or when we just meet and talk about compliance issues, the feedback or the comments that I get are, I sure wish somebody would have explained this to me when I was in seminary before I got out here to plant a new church. I had no idea that these things were all the things that I needed to know or do. And I'm working with a pastor now down in San Diego, where we just finished up the bylaws for his church, and he and I are going to work on putting together a series of training videos.
Well, there is definitely a need for them. And maybe your next thing, fire drill, you can do the compliance boot camp, even more intense, right? You hire someone to scream at people, or something like that. Drill sergeant. Max, you mentioned that training is often not provided as part of a formal education for someone going into ministry, whether they're professional or lay staff. What's the best way to get informed and stay informed? Should they do like the fire drill every 2 or 3 years, or do you have any thoughts on that?
The whole issue of governance, which in the half-day workshop, I usually spend the first hour or a little more than an hour going over just governance issues. Once the governance of the church is well established through a good set of bylaws, mostly it's keeping up with policies and procedures, adjusting policies and procedures to fit the changing circumstance of the church. And so ongoing compliance training is not as intense as it might be initially. Mostly it's just keeping up with new changes in the law, things that affect the church going forward. Most of those issues are going to be employment related, especially here in California, but no less so in any other state, because what happens here in California just seems to filter across the United States eventually. New York and California have a competition saying who can be the most employer unfriendly environment. California is going to make it really tough for the fast food vendors with a new commission that they're establishing that's going to have the authority to raise minimum wage for fast food establishments to $23 an hour come 2024. So that's going to have a ripple effect even on churches. How are you going to hire workers in the church at $15 or $16 an hour if they can go to McDonald's and make 23? It's going to force employers of all types to raise their wages just to be able to keep employees, and it's going to make things just that much more difficult to do business here.
Good insights. I want to thank everyone for their great questions. And there's a couple of questions we couldn't get to. And usually, sometimes these questions are very specific and we can't unpack everything. So what we at Ministry Pacific, what we desire to do with these webinars is that they are just the beginning of the discussion, not the last word. And so I encourage everybody, if you have follow-up, please contact Max. He's more than willing to hear what's going on and point you in the right direction from an insurance point of view, liability coverage, property coverage, some of these more specialized coverages surrounding litigation that may impact churches and nonprofits at Ministry Pacific. We are happy to be of service, and consultations also, again, are always free. So thank you all. Get in touch with Max or Ministry Pacific and get these questions resolved so that you can sleep at night and know you've done all that you can to stay in the good graces of the law. And we appreciate all of your help. So thank you, Max, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.